Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program, Tainted Games, the Role of Race and Racism in the Berlin Olympics of 1936. I'd like to start by thanking our community partners for this program. We sincerely appreciate your support. Big Brothers, Big Sisters Lone Star, High of Dallas, Cristo Rey Dallas College Prep, Legacy Senior Communities, Maccabi USA, Mosaic Family Services, Jewish Southwest Congress, and Temple Shalom. I'd also like to give a special welcome to our museum members and our board members joining us for this evening's program. Thank you so much for your continued support. We couldn't do programs like this tonight, like tonight's, without you, so thank you. We present tonight's program as part of our permanent exhibition highlight series, which expands on themes from the museum's permanent exhibition. Shortly, we will hear about how racial politics and theories of race defined all aspects of the 1936 Olympics, which were held in Nazi-ruled Berlin. This program is especially timely as August marks the 80th anniversary of these games. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. David Clay Large is Senior Fellow at the Institute of European Studies, University of California, Berkeley, co-director of Berkeley's Austrian Studies program, and the Roger Boas Professor of History at the Fromm Institute at the University of San Francisco. A research scholar specializing in modern Central European history, he has published 13 books and dozens of articles, including studies of the German-hosted Olympic Games in 1936 and 1972, and narrative histories of Munich and Berlin. He is also the author of Nazi Games, the Olympics of 1936. We will leave plenty of time for questions at the end of tonight's program, so please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen and type that and submit your question, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Large.
David, if you'll just start your video for us as well, in the bottom left.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it here.
No, you're good.
Do you have it now?
We don't. Let me try this. I'm going to ask you to start it. And that might give you a pop-up that will
Start my video. Right, there we go.
There we go.
There we
now
go.
we see ya.
Right, okay. That's great. All right, well, thank you very much for joining me and the others at this very interesting Zoom conference. I'm not a great fan of the Zoom business, but I know that's what we have to do these days, and I'll try to do my best. As you just heard, we're going to talk about race and politics in the 36 Games. I'll take you through the major issues of that. I should talk maybe for, I don't know, 40 minutes or so, and then we should have some time for questions. All right, this is the title of the talk is Tainted Games, the Role of Race and Racism in the 36 Berlin Olympics. Now, despite claims from Olympic organizers and advocates of the Games that the enterprise that they cherish so much is invariably above politics, quote unquote. The modern Olympic movement, in fact, has from the outset been rife with nationalistic rivalries, ethnic and religious antagonisms, ideological posturing, no doubt about that, and racial and prejudice. So in other words, for all the talk about international brotherhood, you hear that a lot, and peaceful competition among the youth of the world, the Olympic festivals have always mirrored the contentious political and social realities transpiring in the world outside the athletic arena. Yet no single modern Olympiad has betrayed this state of affairs more prominently than Berlin in 1936, those infamous Nazi Games. They transpired against a turbulent backdrop of epic ideological conflict, we know that, a deep economic depression, and agonizing worries about a possible new military conflagration on the horizon. If we contend variously that the International Olympic Committee, or IOC, reached bottom, say, when opting for Moscow Summer Games in 1980, or deciding for Beijing summer 2008, or handing over the 2014 Winter Games to Sochi, Russia, if we maintain that was a kind of low point, or those were low points, I think it would behoove us to recall that what transpired in the Nazi capital in the summer of 1936 really sets a framework or precedent for all of that, no doubt about it. Now, what about the award to Berlin in the first place? Well, it occurred on April 29th, 1931. The IOC voted 43-16 to hold the Olympic Summer Games of 36 in Berlin over run-up of Barcelona. At that time, as you may know, Germany was still a democracy, albeit a very beleaguered one. And some of the IOC voters apparently hoped that a Berlin-based Olympiad might help buttress the so-called Weimar Republic, the Democratic Republic, which was suffering hugely in those days from surging economic depression, violent assaults from political extremists, especially and most notably the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler. And less than 2 years after that historic vote in 31, sure enough, Germany fell under the control of a Nazi-based government that stood as a mockery of the purported Olympic ideals of fair play, brotherhood, and peaceful competition among all the peoples of the world, regardless of nationality, race, religion, or ethnicity. The triumph of Hitler's movement in Germany brought 3 Olympics-related questions immediately to the fore. First, would the new Nazi government elect to retain an Olympics hosting obligation taken on by its democratic predecessor? Second, if the Germans indeed opted to do this, would the IOC hold on to its choice of Berlin as the venue for the 36 Summer Games? And also, I should add, to Garmisch-Partenkirchen for the Winter Games of that year in 1936. And finally, if the IOC stuck to its venue guns, especially with respect to Berlin, would all the nations invited to Hitler's big party, above all the major democratic nations like America, Britain, France, and Canada, would they all accept the German organizers' invitation? Or would they try to move the party elsewhere, right? Move it to some other city, and or elect to stay home, to boycott, if Germany indeed remained the host? So those are the big questions that immediately came to the fore after Hitler had assumed power in January of 1933. With regard to that first question, the Hitler government's stance on hosting the 36th Olympiad, many people in Germany believed that the Fuhrer would shake off this enterprise like some piece of dreck stuck to his shoe. After all, various National Socialist leaders and sports commentators over the years had shown nothing but contempt for the modern Olympic movement, and indeed for most international sporting events, calling instead for purely German competitions and fitness programs based on Turnen, a synchronized group gymnastics, very popular in Germany, starting in the 19th century. In the early 1920s, these zealots had objected to Germans competing against athletes from the Allied countries, which had imposed the so-called yoke of Versailles, the Versailles Treaty, on the fatherland. They had also objected to Aryans, quote unquote again, competing with alleged racial inferiors such as Slavs, Blacks, and of course, Jews. The Nazi objection to competing with Black athletes had a special relevance for the American Olympic program. Having had a modest presence in the Summer Olympics starting in Antwerp in 1920 and then Paris in 24, African-American athletes had burst very prominently onto the Olympic stage at the Los Angeles Games of 1932. Runners Eddie Tolan and Ralph Metcalfe, labeled the Sable Cyclones in the press, had excelled in the sprints, with Tolan setting a world record in the 100-meter race and an Olympic record in the 200-meter event. For Nazi ideologues, it was a disgrace that white athletes, including a German runner by the name of Arthur Jonat, had deigned to compete at all with the likes of Tolan and Metcalfe. Der Völkische Beobachter, the Nazis' in-house journal, demanded in August of 1932 that Blacks be excluded, and I'm quoting here, excluded from any German-hosted Olympic festival should one in fact transpire. And given the prospect that the Americans were likely to have Blacks on their team for 36, probably even more than they had in 1932, the Nazi paper was very dubious about the advisability of a Berlin-hosted Olympiad. Adolf Hitler, the man in whose purview this Olympics decision clearly fell, did not begin to view the prospect of hosting the quadrennial athletic spectacle more favorably until several months after assuming the chancellorship in 1933. In March of that year, one of the key members of the German Olympic Organizing Committee, Theodor Lewald, who happened to be, there he is, Theodor Lewald, who happened to be half Jewish, argued in a meeting with the Fuhrer that hosting the games would provide an invaluable propaganda opportunity for Germany and undoubtedly constitute an economic windfall for the cash-starved treasury. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels argued along similar lines. But what really seems to have erased Hitler's initial opposition to hosting the Olympics was the possibility, the prospect really, of building a grandiose stage for the games in the Nazi capital. Remember, Hitler was a kind of architect monkey. He loved nothing more than designing buildings and that kind of thing. He also looked forward to the possibility of a demonstrating, quote unquote, master race superiority on the athletic field. In May 1933, he therefore let it be known that his government would not only support the Olympic enterprise, but would host the most magnificent Olympic festival ever. Yet even while belatedly endorsing the games, the Nazi government and German sporting associations pursued policies that clashed sharply with Olympic principles of openness and fair play in competition. The Hitler government's program of anti-Jewish discrimination and persecution thoroughly embraced the world of sport, which was forced into conformity with Nazi dogma. In spring 1933, the German Swimming Association banned all Jews from its member clubs. About the same time, Germany's Davis Cup team expelled one of its stars, Dr. Daniel Prenn, from its ranks because he was Jewish. There's Daniel Prenn. The Nazi press also called for the dismissal of Theodor Lewald on grounds of his part Jewish ancestry, and he surely would have been pushed out had not the IOC warned that such a move might compromise Germany's chances of holding on to the 36 games, including the festival in Berlin. The retention of Lewald, however, was hardly enough to reassure a growing chorus of critics around the world who objected that Nazi Germany was hardly the proper site for an athletic spectacle celebrating international brotherhood. Such criticism broached the possibility that the IOC might take the 36 games away from Germany, or if that didn't happen, raise the specter of a large-scale boycott of the Berlin Games. Determined to keep the games in Germany and to nip in the bud any potential boycott movement, Theodor Lewald convinced the Hitler government to issue a statement promising to respect the Olympic Charter and to welcome to Germany, here I quote, competitors of all races, unquote. The regime added, however, a significant caveat. The composition of Germany's own teams, either in Garmisch or in Berlin, was nobody's business but Germany's. The Germans hoped that the IOC would agree with this. And in fact, for the most part, the IOC did agree. IOC president at that time, Henri de la Ballet-Latour, there's a shot of him, Ballet-Latour, who was a conservative, very conservative Belgian aristocrat, harbored the view, which was shared by other Olympic officials, that the Olympic Committee should avoid taking any political positions, except in the case of communist penetration of the games, which he believed must be thwarted at all costs. Thus, he issued a statement saying the IOC would hold to its 1931 decision for Berlin, as long as Germany imposed no racial or religious restrictions on foreign competitors. Ballet-Latour's stance essentially guaranteed that the 36 Summer Games in Berlin would stay in that city, but not that they would go unboycotted. In fact, an international boycott movement now began to crystallize and take on momentum. Interestingly enough, this protest movement had its origins and by far greatest resonance in America, a nation hardly without its own policies of racial discrimination in sport and elsewhere. Early on, the American push to boycott a Nazi-hosted Olympiad in Berlin was largely a Jewish affair. American Jews, understandably, having reacted with great alarm and outrage to the Hitler government's anti-Semitic pronouncements and policies. Various Jewish groups went to Avery Brundage, asked Avery Brundage, a crusty Chicago-based construction magnate and president of the American Olympic Committee, to endorse the boycott effort unless the Germans opened their own Olympic program to qualified competitors regardless of race. There is Avery Brundage, you can see here next to, actually that's the ship that's taking off, leaving New York Harbor for Berlin in 36. What the Jewish activists who went to Brundage didn't know was that Brundage, something of an anti-Semite himself, as well as a militant anti-communist, was a major advocate of Nazi-hosted games and dead set against any efforts to boycott them. Like Ballet-Latour, Brundage justified his support of the German games on the grounds that high-level sports and politics simply occupied different independent realms, and that the Olympic movement could survive only if politics, by which he meant left-wing politics, was kept out of it. Only later, as president of the IOC in the 50s to the early 70s, only later did Brundage come around to the idea that the USSR and other communist nations should be admitted to the Olympic fold, mainly because that was the only way the organization could really expand. So the German Olympic organizers were understandably pleased by Brundage's stance, but they worried that he might not be able to prevent American Jews from somehow scuttling US participation in the German Games, especially the main pageants scheduled for Berlin. Jewish groups, the Germans knew, were threatening to withhold financial contributions to the American Olympic program should the American Olympic Committee vote to send a team to Berlin. Thus, again, on the initiative of Theodor Lewald, the Germans decided to concede more ground, at least on paper. In June 33, they promised not only to observe all Olympic regulations, but also that, here I quote, Jews would not be excluded from membership in German teams, unquote, either for Garmisch or for Berlin. The reality, however, was that Jewish athletes, of whom Germany actually had a sizable number, were simply not considered for membership on the German Olympic teams. Most notably, a German Jewish female high jumper named Gretl Bergmann was denied a chance. Here's Gretl. Was denied a chance to compete in the qualifying rounds for Berlin, even though she had won the German national championship in 1935. Moreover, anti-Semitic policies in other dimensions of public life in Nazi Germany continued unabated. Against this backdrop of persistent government-backed racism in Germany, the American boycott movement expanded beyond its original largely Jewish base to include Catholic and Protestant organizations, labor groups, the American Civil Liberties Union, and other concerned organizations. On March 7th, 1934, a giant rally was held in Madison, New York's Madison Square Garden to protest Nazi racial policies and to threaten boycotts of German goods along with the Olympics if these policies persisted. Major sponsors of this rally included the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, the American Federation of Labor, and the labor-backed National Committee to Aid Victims of Fascism. Also front and center was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which insisted that African-American athletes, including that already famous shoe-in for the American track team, Jesse Owens, must shun Hitler's games on grounds that Nazi Germany was hostile to Blacks as well as to Jews, which was certainly true. The NAACP warned that Blacks might be mistreated if they dared show up in Berlin. Apparently accepting this argument, Jesse Owens actually initially declared that he would boycott Berlin should he be selected for the American team. The diversity of the Madison Square Garden protests notwithstanding, the prominence of labor's role within this enterprise allowed advocates of an American presence in Berlin to denounce the naysayers as one big pack of communists. Yet, writing off the boycott movement as a product of Jewish communist machinations did not mean that it could be ignored. Definitely troubled by the groundswell of anti-Berlin sentiment, Avery Brundage himself decided to undertake what he called a fact-finding mission to Germany in the fall of 1934, promising to investigate what he called rumors about racial discrimination in that country. During this amazing trip, he interviewed a few German Jewish athletic officials, albeit always in the presence of uniformed SS officers. At one point, he put his Nazi hosts at ease by pointing out that his own men's club back in Chicago excluded Jews and Blacks. Upon his return to America, Brundage unsurprisingly gave the Germans a complete clean bill of health, saying he saw no evidence whatsoever of racism, and echoing German assurances that there would be no discrimination against any of the foreign athletes who would compete in Berlin. Undeterred by Brundage's whitewash of Nazi Germany, the American boycott movement continued to expand. Thus, in yet another effort to undercut domestic protest sentiment in the US, Charles Sherrill, who was one of 3 American members of the IOC, and like Brundage, a strong proponent of keeping the games free of quote unquote politics, traveled to Germany in the summer of 1935 with the goal of persuading Adolf Hitler to include at least one Jew in his Olympic program, a gesture he privately equated with the American tradition of the token Negro. Although he found his task of pressuring the Fuhrer somewhat distasteful, he thought America had no business telling the Nazis to eschew racism when it harbored plenty of racism itself, a racism he personally he personally shared. Cheryl warned Hitler that unless he added a Jew, one or two, to Germany's Olympic program, Berlin advocates like himself and Brundage might not be able to prevent a US boycott of 1936. Hitler, interestingly enough, briskly rebuffed Cheryl, even threatening to call off the whole Berlin Olympic program entirely and to substitute what he called purely German games in place of the international festival. But this was a bluff. Hitler knew well that German-only games would be useless in terms of propaganda, and they would hardly facilitate the desired generation of foreign currency. In the end, then, he acquiesced to a gesture of compromised tokenism worked out between Cheryl and the German organizing committee. The Germans agreed to name a half-Jewish fencer named Helene Mayer to its program, to its team for Berlin. Let me give you a shot there of her. For the Nazis, this decision was made more palatable by the fact that Mayer was an excellent fencer with medal-winning prospects for Germany. Moreover, she looked the part of a perfect Aryan Valkyrie with long blonde hair, as you could see there, blue eyes, and a statuesque physique. Finally, Mayer, who was then living in exile in Oakland, California, promised not to criticize the Nazi regime in any way. The Mayer concession undoubtedly weakened the American boycott effort, which was further undermined by a lack of public support from President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who kept silent on this issue despite calls from U.S. consulate officials in Berlin to come out in favor of the boycott and to as a way of expressing U.S. disapproval of Nazi policies. At a crucial meeting of the American Athletic Association and the AOC in December of 1935, Brundage was thus able to outmaneuver his opponents and by a very close vote, secure an endorsement of US participation in the German games, Garmisch and Berlin, especially Berlin being the more important one. Meanwhile, for its part, the NAACP also proved unsuccessful in its effort to get American Blacks, including above all Jesse Owens, to shun Berlin. There's very interesting correspondence, by the way, between Jesse Owens and the head of the NAACP. Owens, in particular, hoped not only to showcase his brilliance on a major international stage, but also envisaged parlaying expected Olympic gold into a profitable post-games professional career that never materialized. America's decision to go to Berlin helped to undercut a similar boycott efforts elsewhere in the democratic West, from Great Britain through Switzerland and also Canada. I can't take you through all of the details of these other boycott efforts. Suffice it to say that these other countries are simply waiting on the U.S. for the U.S. to decide what to do before they would declare whether they would send teams to Berlin. In the end, as a matter of fact, no nations elected to boycott Hitler's games, although Spain failed to send a team to Germany due to the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in July of 1936, but no national boycotts. In hindsight, we can see that the collapse of the anti-Berlin crusade pointed up a larger reality about Olympic boycott efforts over the years. They have tended to be successful only when backed by national governments, as would be the case with the state-driven boycotts of the 1980s. Of course, Moscow 1980 and Los Angeles 1984. On the other hand, the willingness of the national Olympic committees to accept the German organizers' invitation to Berlin did not mean that some individual athletes, most of them Jewish, didn't choose to carry out single personal boycotts of their own. Perhaps the most prominent personal boycotts that I want to mention anyway, involved three Jewish swimmers from Austria. Here they are. That's Judith Deutsch, Ruth Langer, and Lucy Goldner. Despite growing anti-Semitism in their own country, Austria, all three had been named to the Austrian team for Berlin by virtue of their stellar performances in the Austrian national championships. They all quit to protest anti-Jewish persecution in Germany. Such was the case also with Canada's best lightweight boxer, Sammy Lufspring, who told the Toronto Globe that it would have been unconscionable for him to compete in a land, quote, that would exterminate the Jews if it could, unquote. Three Jewish American runners considered likely possibilities for Team USA, namely Milton Green, Norman Connors, and Herman Newgrass, refused to participate in the American Olympic tryouts after learning of Nazi Germany's Nuremberg laws and its persecution laws of the Nuremberg in 1935. Yet another boycotter of the trials was a Jewish American discus, javelin, shot put standout, Lillian Copeland, who had won the female discus competition back in Los Angeles in 1932. So you do have these individuals staying out, and that's important, no doubt about it. But again, just to emphasize, no national boycotts. And alas, personal boycotts by a few individual athletes of conscience didn't have much of an impact on the Berlin Games. Their absence was hardly noted. Yet, before leaving this topic, we might well ask what might have been the consequence had entire national teams, like the US, had entire national teams decided to stay away from Berlin. At the very least, I think, a wide-scale sit-out from the democratic countries would have ruined Hitler's Olympic Party, no question about that. And this, in turn, would have been a major blow to a regime that had invested huge resources in the Olympic project, and which was still struggling to consolidate its power and prestige at home amid ongoing economic depression, worries regarding Nazism's image around the globe, and growing anxieties over the Reich's rearmament program. So again, that's a what-if scenario. We don't know for sure what might have happened, but that's my best guess. Now, just let me conclude by talking a little bit about policing and persecution and protest. The German Olympic organizers, along with the Hitler government, were careful to extend a warm welcome to the hundreds of foreign athletes descending on Berlin in the summer of 1936. Orders went out from Goebbels and others to be gracious and cordial to all visiting Olympians, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. With the exception of a large contingent from Japan, a small one from China, and even smaller ones from India and a few Latin American countries, the foreign squads at Berlin were overwhelmingly Caucasian. America's team for Berlin, however, boasted 18 Blacks and 6 Jews, far more than ever before, and certainly a clear challenge to Nazi doctrines regarding racial homogeneity. Nevertheless, Team USA's Jews and Blacks experienced none of the hostility or mistreatment that they'd been warned to expect from various groups at home. The American Jews on the team saw no signs of open anti-Semitism in the streets, such displays having been banned by the Nazi government for the duration of the Games. The Jewish athletes were very careful not to draw attention to themselves. As for the American Blacks in Berlin in 1936, they were greeted quite enthusiastically by the locals. Jesse Owens, whose athletic feats were well known to German fans, was mobbed by autograph seekers wherever he went in town. Here he is in the at the stadium itself, but when he was walking around town, he would be pestered constantly by autograph seekers and by young women pressing love letters into his hands. But what Jesse Owens and his Black teammates did not know was that they were being closely monitored by the German police during their time in Berlin. The German police, who were determined to prevent any quote unquote unsuitable contacts between the visitors and the natives. Fearing possible acts of miscegenation between the Black Americans and willing German women, the Gestapo issued 52 warning citations to female citizens, quote, for approaching foreigners, especially colored foreigners, in an unseemly manner, unquote. Moreover, Owens and other visiting Olympians had their incoming and outgoing mail screened by a special Gestapo unit stationed at the Charlottenburg post office. Among the hundreds of anti-Nazi messages that this unit intercepted was a missive from England addressed to Owens personally and calling on him publicly, quote, to reject with contempt, unquote, any medal he might win at the Berlin Games. Owens, of course, never received this letter. Not surprisingly, the Reich security agencies monitoring the visiting Olympians worked in strict secrecy. A Gestapo order decreed, here I quote, under no circumstances must our Olympic visitors be given the impression that they are under police observation, nor must our preemptive measures become a source of irritation for foreign guests, unquote. Spies who kept tabs on the comings and goings of the visiting Olympic teams at the Olympic operated under the guise of student helpers. The Kriminalpolizei, the criminal police service, stationed at the Berlin Olympic Village, was disguised as an information center and staffed by very pretty young women. To the relief of the German authorities, Berlin 36 witnessed no prominent demonstrations of discontent or political activism by athletes on the victory podium, unlike later festivals, famous examples such as Mexico City 68 and also Munich in 72. Yet the festival was not without some subtler gestures of courageous opposition to the prevailing political realities. Most noteworthy of these involved the winner of the marathon, Hite Son. Although competing with the rising sun emblem on his shirt, Son was actually Korean, latter-day booty of Japan's 1910 annexation of Korea. On the victory podium, Son duly bowed his head like any good Japanese, but then proceeded to declare in interviews afterwards that he had made this gesture not out of reverence for Japan, but and here I quote, in silent shame and outrage, unquote, over Japan's occupation of the land he considered his own. Son's behavior did not occasion much comment at the time, but the Japanese were so angered by the runner's action that they banned him from competition for the rest of his life. Son, however, did get the last laugh. 52 years later, he carried the Olympic torch into the main stadium at the opening day of the 1988 Seoul Olympics. In another gesture of courageous defiance, albeit one that did not come to light until many years later, a Turkish fencer by the name of Halet Sambel, the first Muslim female competitor in Olympic history, flatly refused an order from her delegation chief to meet with Hitler as a show of Turkish-German friendship. Here she is in a later photograph. Unlike many Turks at the time, Sambel was anything but a fan of the Nazis. Interestingly enough, America's Jesse Owens issued not a word of negative comment regarding the Nazi Reich, despite having initially said he would boycott Berlin. Had Owens received that Gestapo intercepted appeal to protest Nazi racism on the victory podium in Berlin, he certainly would have ignored it, because since arriving at in the Nazi capital, he had become something of a Hitler admirer. Far from feeling that he had been snubbed by Hitler in the Berlin Stadium, as popular lore still has it, he insisted that the Fuhrer had kindly waved to him from the stands. Upon his return to America after the games, he publicly praised Hitler as, I quote, the man of the hour, and chided the American press for being, quote, unfair to the Nazi leader. He announced that if anyone had snubbed him in Berlin, it was not Hitler, but President Roosevelt, who had neglected to send him a congratulatory telegram. Owens also figured in an enduring controversy at these games concerning the only two Jewish members of the US track squad in 36, sprinters Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller. There they are. There, that Stoller is on the right, Glickman on the left. Originally scheduled to run in the 4x100 meter men's relay race, these two were removed by their American coaches at the very last minute to make way for Owens and his African-American teammate, Ralph Metcalf. Naturally, Glickman and Stoller were deeply angered by their coach's move, which Glickman, for the rest of his life, attributed to an intervention by none other than Avery Brundage, who, according to Glickman, wanted to spare Hitler the embarrassment of seeing his German trackmen defeated by Jews as well as by blacks. Given that Brundage was an anti-Semite, it's quite possible that he did indeed intervene in this fashion. But as far as I know, and I've looked into the subject quite a bit, I couldn't find any hard evidence to support this. And that's not out of any love for Avery Brundage. I think it's just one of those controversies that are likely to remain unclarified unless new evidence comes to light. But back now quickly to those German worries about embarrassing protests at the games. They were not confined to just foreign athletes. Vigilant policing applied to Olympic visitors in general, while measures of proactive repression targeted residents of the Nazi capital, considered potentially troublesome. Concerned that, and here I quote, foreign communists disguised as harmless Olympic visitors, unquote, might try to sabotage the festival in some way, the Gestapo chief in Prussia ordered all his agents to be on high alert. Fears that underground communist cells might exploit the Olympic spotlight on Berlin to raise their ugly heads spurred a series of police raids and the mass incarceration of leftists in a brand new concentration camp opened just in time for the Olympic Games, called Sachsenhausen. It's in a northern suburb of Berlin, Oranienburg, but the camp is called Sachsenhausen. Sachsenhausen lager housed, in addition to political prisoners, various so-called asocial elements, such as unregistered prostitutes, homosexuals, and beggars. At the time of the games, this sprawling camp's capacity was already overstretched due to all the problematical elements being swept up in the Nazi dragnet. Ad hoc jails like the Municipal Work and Detention House in Berlin, Rummelsberg, also joined the Nazis' growing repertoire of emergency housing for an imagined army of Olympics disruptors. Finally, to lock away out of sight a social group considered both racially inferior and a grave danger to society, namely gypsies, the German authorities opened yet another new detention facility, the so-called Zigeuner Lager, or gypsy camp, in the Berlin district of Marzahn. Although justified as a measure to guarantee Olympic visitors a quote-unquote clean and safe environment during their stay, the Marzahn facility remained in use well after the games, ultimately serving as a way station to later liquidation of this population at camps in the East. For the Nazis, such proactive repression seems to have paid off. For the Berlin Games went ahead without any major disturbances. Yeah, there were some small protests here and there, but these were all isolated and by just individuals, no major group protests at all. Thus, in a secret post-games assessment, Berlin Chief of Police Count Heinrich von Heldor took pride in a job well done. Here I quote, "The success of the police measures taken on the occasion of the Olympic Games is the best demonstration of the rightness of the struggle that we have been waging since the party came to power against professional criminals, traffic offenders, profiteers, and other enemies of the people," unquote. The Nazis also found convincing evidence for the rightness of their policies and their governmental system in the final outcome of the athletic competitions in Berlin. True, the Americans, in particular Black Americans, had managed to dominate track and field. But Nazi pundits found a way to explain this result in self-serving racist terminology. America had cheated by deploying a host of Black auxiliaries, said the Nazis. Or as one Nazi official put the matter, quote, "If Germany had had the bad sportsmanship to enter deer or another species of flat-footed animal, it would have taken the honors from America in the track and field competition," unquote. Actually, to put this German argument in proper perspective, we should note that many Americans interpreted the Black successes in Berlin in pretty much the same fashion. American experts, including the track coaches of Team USA, explained the achievements of Jesse Owens and other quote unquote race boys as in terms of specific physiological advantages for Negroes derived from their so-called jungle inheritance. I'm quoting. Thus, it was argued that while Blacks might be able to sprint and jump well, they could never excel in competitions requiring discipline, intelligence, teamwork, and stamina. Sports like long distance running and basketball. They do not. Basketball was one of those sports where Blacks could not compete, according to these pundits. In any event, despite the humiliations in track, Germany emerged as the clear winner in the overall medal count, garnering 89 prizes compared to second place America's relatively feeble 56. Moreover, because Germany's fascist militarist soulmates, Italy and Japan, also did very well in Berlin, while once powerful Britain and France lost ground, the Reich could crow that Berlin 36 demonstrated an emerging superiority on the part of tightly disciplined authoritarian nations over effete liberal democracies. Thanks a lot. I'll stop with that and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, David. I am going to stop your share.
Okay.
I'm going to join you for questions. So we do have a couple questions coming in. And again, if you have more questions, please feel free to use the Q&A. David, thank you so much for that. Our first question, you talked about the individual boycott that some US athletes just chose on their own not to attend. And this is a little bit of a personal opinion question, but given the level of celebrity that so many athletes have today, I think we can all think of Olympians we're very familiar with. Do you think it would have a much different impact in a modern day Olympics if, say, a Simone Biles or a Michael Phelps or these names that we know well? Do you think it would have a different impact?
Absolutely would have, yes. The people I mentioned, the individuals, were not celebrities in their own day. I mean, they were known in sports circles, but that's about it. So their absence from the games was not really much remarked upon at the time, and it didn't cut much ice, unfortunately. I mean, it deserves to be mentioned. It takes courage to do something like that, and it means putting off all of that. These people had trained, for the games, and then they decide not to go. So it's important. But yes, you're right. If LeBron James or somebody, decides to boycott, that means something more.
And then on the flip side, so the athletes who chose to still attend, especially athletes of color or Jewish athletes, is there any evidence of any of those athletes choosing to go, I guess for lack of a better term, to kind of rub their prowess and Hitler and the Nazis face, since they thought of them as inferior? Was anything like that happening in their mind, you know?
Well, that's what some of the African Americans did claim that, but I think they're more the deeper cause for their decision to go was they wanted to show off their abilities on this great international stage.
We have another question, and this is a sort of a broad question, I guess, but you know, with this massive boycott in the U.S., we had other Western European democratic countries who sort of followed the U.S.'s lead in continuing to go to the games. What's in it for the IOCs? Is it money? Is it glory? Like, why did the American IOC? I know Brundage has his own set of issues, many of them did, but you know, what was the drive to go, given the public opinion?
Well, people like Brundage thought it was the very survival of the games. He really did believe that if boycotts emerged, large-scale boycotts emerged, that the games would die. He didn't think they could survive that. So the glory of the IOC, in which he believed, he and Halet Latour and others before him, really did believe in the glorious enterprise of the Olympics. It wasn't so much money then. It is now, by the way. It's very much money now. I mean, the main reason why the recent games in Tokyo weren't canceled was the IOC needed that television revenue. It draws 75% of its funds from television, and you can't televise canceled games. So money is the thing now. It wasn't so much then, but it was the sense that this whole enterprise will not survive if there's too much in the way of boycotting.
Our next question is about Hitler's reaction to Jesse Owens' medal sweep in track and field. Mm-hmm. Did Hitler present any of the medals, or was there any more acknowledgement than the wave that you mentioned? No,
he didn't present any of the medals. What he did do in the first 2 or 3 days of the games, which he wasn't supposed to do, was he invited winners to come up to his private box in the stands and get a handshake from him, right? So this was something that heads of state are not supposed to do in the Olympics. It was kind of verboten. He did it anyway. So the president of the IOC in those days, Halet Latour, went to Hitler and said, "Look, if you're going to congratulate winners, in the stands, you're going to have to do this with every winner down the line, including possibly American blacks." So Hitler said, "Oh no, all right, I'm not going to do this anymore," and he stopped that practice.
We also have a question. What role, if any, did Leni Riefenstahl's film Olympia play in amplifying Hitler's messaging about the Olympics? And maybe you could give us just a little bit of context on Leni Riefenstahl.
Right. Leni Riefenstahl was Hitler's favorite filmmaker. She'd made a film called Triumph of the Will about the 1934 party rallies. And there's no question that this is her film Olympia is quite a political film, though she would always claim that it was apolitical, that it was just a work of cinema. But there are lots of different ways in which that film emphasizes German Nazi ideals. For the whole beginning of it starts in Greece with the first torch relay. The Nazis invented the torch relay. There had never been a torch relay before then. And one of the Nazi claims was that the Nazi Germany was close in spirit and in soul, if you will, to ancient Athens and ancient Greece, right? So Riefenstahl's film certainly highlights all of that. Again, she claimed not to be a political animal, but she really was, and her film is very, very political. It's also the only thing that a lot of people would know about the Olympics. I mean, the film didn't premiere for another 3 years after the games were over, but people saw it around the world, and for them, that was what the Olympics in Berlin were all about.
Our next question is about, so when Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller were removed from the relay race, was there any response from their fellow American athletes to that?
Well,
spoke out about it, or
the two remaining white athletes were very happy that they weren't taken out, no, they didn't. I don't think there was any complaining about that. They were happy to be there. Owens was happy to be there, and Metcalf was happy to be there. For Owens, it was a chance to win a 4th gold medal. So yeah, absolutely.
We also have Question about Lewald. Am I saying his name
Theodor
correctly?
Lewald, right.
Who you talked about at the beginning, and you mentioned he was half Jewish himself.
Right.
Did he ever comment on the Nazi regime? Make any commentary about that? Did he stay in his
Well,
position through the Olympics?
Absolutely. There was a lot of, I mean, in the popular press, and there was a lot of opposition to Lewald on grounds that he was partly Jewish, and had the IOC not, the thing about the IOC is they don't like to be told who can represent them in individual countries, and so they made it clear that the Germans couldn't tamper with Lewald being having the prominent position he did.
So far, this is our last question, unless we get any more that sneak in. But and I'm not sure if you'll know the answer to this, but either then or now or in between, in the process where a city bids to host the Olympics, is there any kind of review of their, I guess, human rights? What the status of human rights are in that city? Is there anything built in like that to your knowledge?
Not much. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had Beijing. Well, you wouldn't have had Moscow in 1980. You wouldn't have had probably even Seoul in 1988. You wouldn't have had Sochi 2014, or I mean, no, the IOC does not really pay much attention to that. It pays attention to technical issues and to the financial wherewithal of the host cities, but not so much human rights.
Maybe an improvement we can make in the future. Who knows? Well, David, I think that's all we have for you. Again, we so appreciate you being with us tonight, for sharing, especially some of these lesser known stories that I think, we hear the classics, but not always some of those other stories. So we appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us tonight out there. We hope
And thank you for joining it. Yeah, I add my thanks too.
Oh, of course. Hope everyone stays well, stays safe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Take